Thank you for joining us tonight. We are playing pre-event slides. Live from NYPL presents Let the Record Show, Sarah Schulman with Kwame Anthony Appiah, June 21st, 2021, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. This slide shows an image of the featured book. The cover text appears on a red background, which is torn at the edges to resemble a weathered street poster. The text reads, A Political History of ACT UP, New York, 1987 to 1993. Let the Record Show, Sarah Schulman. Around the torn edges, a black and white photograph of a large group of protesters being held back by police is visible. Let the Record Show is available for purchase from the library shop, on.nypl.org/shop-live. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Reserve a copy for free with a New York Public Library card. Visit tonight's event page to find this title in a variety of formats, nypl.org/live. The last slide shows recommended reading. Sarah Schulman suggests these titles for further reading. Kool-Aids by Robbie Alameddine. Veronica by Mary Gateskill. Hold Tight Gently by Martin Duberman. Patient Zero and the Making of the AIDS Epidemic by Richard McKay. Check out the full list and other titles by tonight's speakers by visiting tonight's event page, nypl.org/live.
Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us again at Live from NYPL. My name is Jason Bauman. I'm the Susan and Douglas Dillon Associate Director for Collection Development and Coordinator of LGBTQ Collections. And tonight I'm here to welcome you to a conversation with Sarah Schulman and Kwame Anthony Appiah about Sarah's new book, Let the Record Show, A Political History of ACT UP New York, 1987 to 1993. Sarah's book was 20 years in the making. It is the most comprehensive political history ever assembled of ACT UP and AIDS activism in the US. New York Public Library has one of the largest collections of LGBTQ history in the United States, as well as archives documenting the activist response to the HIV/AIDS crisis, including the archives of People with AIDS Coalition, Gay Men of African Descent, Gay Men's Health Crisis, ACT UP New York, and the ACT UP Oral History Project, through which Sarah has made such an essential contribution to documenting this history. If you'd like to access the library's LGBTQ collections, all you need is an NYPL library card, which you can also use to check out Sarah's book, which is available through the library in physical and electronic formats. For help on how to borrow it, scroll down on this event page for more info. And if you're able, you can buy Let the Record Show from the library shop. Proceeds go to benefit the library. The link to purchase is also on the event page, and we'll drop it in the chat too. There are more fantastic Live from NYPL events coming up. Tomorrow, celebrate the birthday of the great Octavia E. Butler with our special night of readings, tributes, and performances. Go to nypl.org live to sign up and see what else is going on. Also, if you're in New York, join us Wednesdays in July for a special series of talks in Bryant Park with authors and historians, including Jelani Cobb, Larry Ty, and past NYPL Duberman Fellow Emily Bass. They're every Wednesday at 5 p.m. in July in the Bryant Park Reading Room. No registration is required. Before I turn it over to tonight's speakers, two quick housekeeping items. The library values your privacy, so we want you to know that even though the video and chat are on an nypl.org page, they are hosted by YouTube. By participating in the chat, you might share data about yourself, which the library does not control. You can learn more by scrolling down on the event page. Also, Sarah is excited to take some of your questions tonight, and you can send them at any time using the chat, Google form, or by emailing publicprograms@nypl.org. She'll get to as many as she can at the end. Okay, please welcome Kwame Anthony Appiah and Sarah Schulman.
Hello, Sarah.
Hi.
It's very nice to see you, and let me add my welcome. And since I'm a trustee of the library, let me welcome you on behalf of the library.
Thank you so much.
So you've published nearly a dozen novels, I think, and more than half a dozen non-fiction books. You've had 3 plays and a couple of movies that you wrote with Cheryl Dunye produced. And you've acted in more than a couple of movies yourself. And,
That's right.
You've produced the documentary United in Anger, A History of ACT UP, which was directed by Jim Hubbard. And beginning 20 years ago, you created an online oral history of ACT UP, which was just mentioned, doing most of the interviewing yourself. You've been involved in activism throughout, both through ACT UP itself and through the Lesbian Avengers, which you helped to co-found in 1992, and which led to the creation of the annual Dyke March, which will be starting outside the library in Bryant Park on June the 26th. And at the same time, you've maintained a career as a journalist and taught writing at CUNY. And I'm sure I've left out a whole bunch of important achievements. So my first question is, what do you do in your spare time?
What do I do? I like to hang out with my friends. I like to go to the theater. I go 2 or 3 times a week when there is the theater.
Oh, you do? Wow.
Yeah. My partner lives in Chicago, so I spend quite a bit of time on an airplane. Yeah.
Have you been flying recently?
Well, I spent most of COVID at her house.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Good. That's been difficult not being able to see people.
Yeah.
All right, so we should get down to serious business.
Okay.
The book we're here to talk about is Let the Record Show, A Political History of ACT UP New York, 1987 to 1993. So can we begin with a sketch of what ACT UP New York was in those years? What was going on?
Well, let's go back a little bit. So we now know that AIDS probably existed for about 100 years, may have been in the United States in the 1940s, and certainly was in New York in the 60s and 70s. But science didn't observe the pattern until 1981. And so when we say it's the 40th anniversary of AIDS, it's actually the 40th anniversary of observing the pattern that is AIDS. So the first public announcement was the New York Times article, July 3rd, 1981, 41 cases of rare cancer found in homosexuals in San Francisco. And it's important for people to know the historical context of that announcement. In the 1980s, gay people were a profoundly oppressed minority in this country. Gay sex was illegal. In fact, the sodomy laws were not overturned until 2003. In New York City, there was no gay rights bill. You could be kicked out of your apartment or fired from your job, and you could be refused public accommodation, like restaurant or hotel. Familial homophobia was virulent, and street violence against gay people, gay bashing, was common. So in this environment, there was a lot of stigma about homosexuality and theories about what caused homosexuality and theories that it was biological. So when a disease appeared that seemed to hit homosexuals, at first, the response implied that it was the biological disease of homosexuality itself. And so the first name of this disease was gay-related immune deficiency, GRID, even though there were other people who had AIDS. And phrases like gay cancer, today we know that cancer cannot be gay. But at the time, that was a concept. So in the first 5 years of the epidemic, 40,000 people died in this country. Ultimately, about 600,000 people did die. The government did absolutely nothing, and pharma did nothing. Basically, they tried to recycle failed cancer drugs that they held the patent for. And what the gay community did was try to recreate social services that were lacking, and also familial homophobia played a big role in this because there was not support for a lot of people. So there was a buddy system through Gay Men's Health Crisis, or you could get food through God's Love We Deliver, but there was not a political response. ACT UP was founded in March 1987. Right before ACT UP was founded was the Bowers v. Hardwick decision in the Supreme Court, which upheld the sodomy law. And this was a huge blow to the gay community, that in the middle of this mass death experience, sodomy laws were upheld. And people were furious, and there were demonstrations in the streets without permits. And so there was a real need for a political response. Then in March of 1987, Larry Kramer gave a speech at the Gay and Lesbian Center. And people in the audience were inspired by the speech and decided that they wanted to form a political response. So a few days later, a group of people met and they formed ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power.
Is that what they called themselves on the first day?
It was actually the second meeting.
Second meeting, okay. So, but at the first meeting, they were responding in part to this very powerful speech by Larry Kramer. in the course of which he told them, I think he said, half of you stand up.
Half of you will be dead. Yes.
Half of you will be dead. And so it wasn't, people were angry. They were also, of course, afraid. And the government and the medical establishment, as it were, wasn't doing very much to work on dealing with this medical crisis.
Right. There was the people who AIDS primarily affected, which were poor people, people of color, gay people, and Haitians, were all groups that really had very little power and were socially marginalized. And what the problem with pharma was that they were looking for they saw a potentially huge market. And they were looking for the one pill that you would take that would fix your AIDS, because that would be the maximum profit. But the way that AIDS works, so AIDS is an umbrella term, it's like cancer, but it's actually different in each person. And what happens is your immune system ceases to function, so you develop what's called opportunistic infections. So people got dementia or blindness or wasting syndrome where they couldn't process nutrition. And what patients really needed was that each of these opportunistic infections would be treated. But pharma was not going there because these were small market shares. And so they really had to be forced.
Okay. Now, your qualifications for writing this book are pretty striking, because you are talking about this as if you, as it were an historian, but you were actually a member of ACT UP.
Actually, I started writing about AIDS before ACT UP.
You started writing about it before, but I mean, you were there from the very beginning of ACT UP.
No, ACT UP was founded in March and I came in July.
Okay.
But I had already been working as a journalist covering AIDS for 5 years before ACT UP was founded.
And you were also, so you were sort of an insider writing about it as a journalist. And of course, you've worked on that documentary that we mentioned earlier with Jim Hubbard about this. You've collected oral histories for nearly 20 years now, about 20 years now,
Yes.
And those figure very much in the book. I mean, they're part of what you're mining as you tell the story.
Right.
And I'm curious about this, though. You were covering this as a journalist, and I think some journalists would have said, "Well, I have to choose. I have to be either a member of this organization and an activist, or I can cover it." And I'm curious about, you obviously don't think that. So
No.
what would you say? What would you say to them, the people in the journalism schools who tell you can't do this?
Well, fortunately, I never went to a journalism school. I went to the journalism school of hard knocks. So, I learned how to be a journalist so at the end of the 70s, the beginning of the 80s, gay people were not accurately represented in mainstream journalism. And so we had to create our own newspapers. And this had been on for a long time already. So I was writing for Gay Community News, which was a gay and lesbian newspaper, Woman News, which was a lesbian and straight feminist newspaper, the New York Native, which was a gay male newspaper. And these were community-based papers. We were not paid, or we were paid like $15 an article or something like that. But we were very committed, and we were out there, covering our community for our community. And that's really how I learned to be a journalist.
Okay, and that's clearly a model of journalism that we recognize. It's kind of campaigning journalism. It's guided by the same idea as all journalism, which is that you should be telling the truth. You shouldn't be making stuff up, but you're telling it with an agenda. And I think that's very much true about the book, right?
Well, I don't agree with that necessarily, because
Okay.
I think that the corporate press, their agenda was to maintain that homosexuals were inferior.
Yes.
And that was reflected in their either lack of coverage or their distorted coverage. And of course, we had an equality or a liberation agenda. So I think we were actually more truthful than they were.
Yes, but that's the point, right? I mean, as you said, one of the reasons why you needed to be running the gay press was because the non-gay press, the straight press, as it were, was so incredibly bad at telling the truth about lesbian and gay people.
Right.
And so it was needed, but people who wanted to, I mean, I've always thought this about every field, that unless you've got everybody of every sort inside, it's going to get things about the people that aren't there wrong. You need the people who are inside to force you to recognize things from that. We'll get back to this because it's an important part of the story of ACT UP, I think, is how it informed policy and medical developments from the point of view of the people who were at the sharp end of the thing, the people who were
Right.
suffering from the disease. But one way you handle questions of objectivity in the book, because there are disputes, as there always are, about what really happened in some cases, or about the meaning, let's say, of what really happened, is you allow a lot of, because you have access to this vast oral archive, which thanks to you we all have access to, you're able to tell the story, as it were, from many points of view, and to allow the different points of view in a way to emerge by just quoting people who had the different points of view. How did you decide that that was the way you wanted to do it?
Well, thank you for asking that. I have to go back a little bit. So let me just say that, ACT UP had 6 amazing years that I cover in the book, and we'll talk about what they accomplished. And then they had a split that was devastating. But even though they still exist, it diminished quite a bit. In '96 is the protease inhibitors, which are the good drugs. And so people who thought they were going to die lived, and people kind of crawled into their corners and tried to put their lives back together. '99 is the internet revolution. And this left ACT UP in the dust because we were pre-internet. So none of our materials were digitized. There was a period where you could search ACT UP and find nothing. So in 2001, I was driving, and it was the 20th anniversary of AIDS, but it was actually the 20th anniversary of noticing AIDS. And I was listening to radio, and the guy said, well, at first America had trouble with people with AIDS, but then they came around. And I thought, oh no, that is not what happened. And they're just this is going to be that fake story of American progress and benevolence, when the truth is that thousands of people fought until the day they died to force this country to change against its will. So that's when Jim Hubbard and I realized that we needed to create some raw data. Now, one of the great leaders of our movement, Urvashi Vad, was at the Ford Foundation at that time, and she gave us support to start the Oral History Project. So we started interviewing people and just putting the transcripts up open access at our website, which is actuporalhistory.org. And I just want to say we've had over 14 million hits on that website. But we hope that some academics somewhere would analyze the transcripts and we would just create the raw data. But that didn't really happen. Then in 2012, Jim made his film, United in Anger, A History of ACT UP, and that was a combination of the interviews and about 2,000 hours of archival footage that he and James Wency had preserved, which is available open access at New York Public Library. And we literally took that film all over the world. We took it to Russia right after the anti-gay laws. We took it to Palestine, to Lebanon, to Brazil, India, and we always had in the back of our minds that somebody was going to do something with this written material. Then this kind of historicization started to appear that was completely inaccurate. And what it did was it focused on a handful of individuals, all of whom did great work, but it made it look like they did it all themselves. And this is the American John Wayne myth. That the white male individual is going to come in and he's going to rescue everybody and he's going to save the day. And a lot of stories get told that way, but actually nothing happens that way and nothing can happen that way.
Good. So no, go ahead. I was just saying, so the one thesis, as it were, of the book is that the standard narrative ignores, I'd say, 3 things. First of all, it ignores the role of women and people of color in the achievements of ACT UP. Then it ignores, as it were, the collective achievement, the fact that actually it wasn't about a bunch of individual heroes, whether they were men or women, straight or gay, people of color or not. A lot of it was done in groups, and there's what you just, I think an emblematic moment of that sort of groupiness of it is the way in which the very famous and now iconic slogan and symbol of ACT UP, which was the silence equals death with the pink triangle. You tell the story of how that came about, and what's great about the story is you can't say anybody did it. Any one person did it. It emerged from a group, and that's I thought a nice way of sort of emblematizing the way in which it's a story of groups as well as of individuals, and it's also a story that's wrongly historicized because it focuses too much on the white guys.
Well, it's not, most of the white men in ACT UP didn't get historicized either.
Right.
It was just a handful.
Yes.
I mean, in my book, I have 140 people. Most of them are white males, but their
Yes.
stories had never been told. I mean, what's been interesting in terms of the reception of the book is that most white people, most people of color, and most women know that change comes from community, that change comes from collectivity and from coalition. It's only a tiny, tiny group of guys who are still holding on to the John Wayne thing, and they're afraid to give it up. But, you know, we have this, like, the history of the civil rights movement was told through Dr. King, you know, but actually it's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. And that it's that kind of cooperation that makes the zeitgeist change. But how do people who are so different cooperate? And that was one of the secrets of ACT UP that we unearthed by analyzing the transcripts, because there had been no history of ACT UP. ACT UP had never theorized itself. There was no description of the structure of the organization. As we interviewed people, it all started to unfold. And of course, Jim and I were just as guilty as everybody else. We thought that what we and our friends did was ACT UP, and that's what everyone thought.
Yes.
No one had organizational overview. And I don't think there's anyone who's reading this book who is not learning something, because people were so effective and so busy that they really didn't know what else was going on.
One of the other sort of agendas of the book is to get us to see that ACT UP doesn't just belong in gay history, that that it was the coming together of a range of very interesting American activist histories, of course, gay and lesbian, but also feminist groups organized around reproductive rights and Black consciousness, Quaker, Jewish, and Catholic left, homeless rights activism, and use tactics developed by the civil rights movement, including nonviolent protest, which we can trace back perhaps to Gandhi. So that's an Indian origin. Can I invite you just to tell us a little bit about that diversity of the ways in which this event, this phenomenon fits in so many histories?
Well, I think, you know, we have to start with the reason that there was an autonomous gay movement in the first place is because the left did not want homosexuals. And we know that the Communist Party kicked out gay people. Famously, Bayard Rustin was sidelined by the civil rights movement. There's many incidences of lesbian purges in feminism. And so we had an autonomous gay movement because nobody else wanted us. But that doesn't mean it came out of nowhere. You know, many people who were in the gay movement or in the AIDS activist movement had been in previous movements. And one of the things about ACT UP was that older gay men came from gay liberation, but the younger gay white men often did not have any political experience. Many of the women, however, did. They came from the feminist women's health movement, the women's peace movement, the reproductive rights movement. There were people who came from Latin American student movements, who had worked with the Panthers, who had been in CORE. You know, and these people brought in ways of how to think politically, strategies, very key ideas. And in the book, I give the names of these people and which strategies they brought to the movement. But there's also an influence that's larger, which is most of us, I was born in 1958, so most people in ACT UP were born in the 50s or 60s and some in the 40s. So as gay kids, and of course in our generation there was no such concept as gay kids, right? But we knew we were queer kids, that we did not know there was a gay community waiting for us or that there would be a gay movement. But we all saw Black resistance on television. You know, we saw Black people standing up to the police. We saw it in Life magazine and Jet magazine. A number of us had families who participated. We saw Black people doing very theatrical and effective direct action, like sitting in at segregated lunch counters. And we saw nonviolent civil disobedience. Later, when I was researching the book, I reread Dr. King's article, Letter from Birmingham Jail, where he lays out his description of direct action. And it's exactly what ACT UP did. You know, even though we didn't know it and we never acknowledged it, but clearly people had internalized this mode of resistance, and that played out in ACT UP.
So, I mean, your biography, when it comes, is going to say that you were an activist, and one of your book's aims is to draw lessons from ACT UP that future activism can be guided by. You want to draw lessons. You don't just want to tell us something about the past, though it's a very important past, and we should honor it and honor the people that you honor by telling their stories. What are some of those lessons, do you think? What are some of the lessons for activism going forward in the United States, or for that matter, anywhere?
Right. Well, first, let's just say what ACT UP accomplished, because it's astounding how much they won in 6 years. So ACT UP basically participated in forcing pharma and science to change the way they research medications. ACT UP forced the Food and Drug Administration to make experimental drugs available to people who needed them, even if they hadn't been approved. ACT UP forced the Center for Disease Control to change the definition of AIDS so that women could qualify for benefits and experimental drugs. ACT UP made needle exchange legal in New York. ACT UP made it possible for people who are HIV positive to get private insurance. ACT UP stopped the Catholic Church from inhibiting condom distribution in the schools. ACT UP's public schools. ACT UP started housing works for homeless people with AIDS. And ACT UP changed the way that queer people and people with AIDS saw themselves and were depicted in media. So those are very substantial. So how did they do it? Well, there's some very interesting lessons there. My favorite really is that ACT UP was not a consensus-based movement, in that they didn't all have to agree. They weren't pushing everyone into one analysis or one strategy. There was a principle of unity, there was a bottom line, and that was direct action to end the AIDS crisis. And that's direct action as opposed to social service provision. But if you were doing direct action to end the AIDS crisis and you had an idea, basically you could do it. And if you had an idea and I didn't want to do it, I would argue with you, because this is pre-gentrification New York culture, right? So everything on the table. But ultimately, I would not try to stop you from doing it. If I didn't agree with it, I just wouldn't do it. And then I would get my people together and we would do what we wanted to do. And this simultaneity of response, this kind of radical democracy, meant that ACT UP was responding on so many different levels at the same time, in so many different social sectors and milieu, that they had a huge impact and an enormous reach. So that's an incredible lesson about big tent politics.
Tell us a little bit, though. I agree, and the book certainly makes that point very effectively, I think. But we haven't really communicated how this was actually done. Okay, so let's talk about the Monday meetings and the different groups and so on.
So ACT UP met at the Lesbian and Gay Center, which was at that time a crumbling school, old school on West 13th Street. And there were meetings every Monday night that were between 300 to 700 people. There were committees, like the Media Committee, the Fundraising Committee, the Actions Committee, and each committee had a representative that went to the Coordinating Committee. It wasn't called the Steering Committee because nobody wanted to be steered. And the Coordinating Committee would make up the agenda. The meetings would be facilitated by like the cutest, sexiest, funniest people, because they were all elected. And they would run the meeting. However, there was a whole other structure. There was also an affinity group structure, where 15 or 20 people would get together and form an affinity group, sometimes for one action, sometimes for many years. They would meet at someone's house, and they would plan often illegal theatrical actions that they would do that they never brought to the floor, and they did not have to get the group's approval, even though ACT UP would give them legal support. And this was because ACT UP felt that it was infiltrated by the police. And actually, at the end of my book, I showed the FBI files, and ACT UP was heavily infiltrated. There was a lot of informants, and you'll see when you look, it's most of it is redacted. But
no, I did see. I did read those pages. It was kind of amazing. I'm wondering. So it turned out that strategy, which I suppose some people at the time might have thought was paranoid, was actually wise and successful, because it meant that some of these illegal actions could proceed without anyone knowing in advance that they were going to happen. If you'd asked for permission for every one of them, the FBI would have been telling the local police, wherever it was, what you were doing.
Now, when you look at footage, if you look at Jim's film United in Anger, which people can see for free on YouTube, there's footage of the meetings, and you can see that it's predominantly white gay men. But people would leave the meetings and they would work on all different kinds of projects in coalitions with all different kinds of people. So ACT UP was working with homeless people, with drug users, with incarcerated people, with HIV-infected mothers, with Haitians. There was all kinds of reach, broadly into the city.
So you've been stressing it recently in this part of the discussion what you might call the democratic character of ACT UP, the fact that every kind of person was free to come and that they were able to act through ACT UP, even though it was 80% white guys, white men, mostly younger white men, in fact. And I'm sort of interested in a tension there is, I think, between the thought that this was a democratic organization and that meeting, when it did decide things, decided by vote, which was a very democratic way of doing these. You have a last meeting, you ask for a vote. But about the archive, for example, you say you wanted to show clearly what we'd witnessed in ACT UP, that people from all walks of life working together can change the world. That's true, but you also say, my perception is the fate of society is determined by very small groups of people. So I'm interested in the tension between the thought that it's basically the challenge of all kind of vanguard activism, right? Which is you're doing it in the name of the people, as it were, you're doing it in the name of everybody, but in fact, there's a few people who are really, as a proportion of the population, there are millions and millions and millions of people in New York City, and at its height, only a few thousand people involved in ACT UP, and only a few of those really making decisive interventions.
That's right.
How do you think about the tension between the idea of sort of vanguard activism, which being really important for social change, which this sort of your work demonstrates and other people have demonstrated with other movements, and the sort of democratic idea, which is, well, in the end, everybody has to have a say, not just every kind of person, but every person.
You know, I think it's characterological. I think there's certain kinds of people who cannot stand by when there's a cataclysm. They cannot be bystanders. And that's a type of person that ACT UP attracted, because after all, most people with AIDS never got involved in AIDS activism. And there were people in ACT UP who did not have AIDS, and people in ACT UP who were straight and who were HIV negative, but they were a type of person. And they were almost like vanguard personalities. But because ACT UP was not theoretical and was driven by the needs of people with AIDS, all of its action and energy was geared towards being effective because the clock was ticking. And people with AIDS had needs, and those needs had to be met immediately. And there wasn't time for theory, and there wasn't time for bureaucracy. And that was really what drove the organization.
Mm-hmm. So just thinking about the question of lessons, as it were, there's one thing about ACT UP that strikes me, maybe other movements can't so easily draw on. And I think of this because a friend of mine who was involved, he's actually mentioned in your book, I won't mention his name, says, this was, those meetings were for, if you were a young gay man, those meetings were, among other things, very sexy. I mean, you mentioned, for example, that Charles King and Keith Seiler got together there, became a couple over the creation of a fact sheet for ACT UP. They were doing something right. ACT UP-ish. But now that sense that this was a sort of sexy environment must have been part of what gave, I mean, so there's the anger, there's the fear and the sense of threat and the fact that nobody's doing anything, but it's also just fantastically sexy for, at least for the gay men. And maybe for some of the lesbians.
There was a lot of lesbian action in ACT UP.
Yes, good.
And bisexual action also.
Yes, which you also mentioned.
And a few straight people who got together also in ACT UP. But, I think for movements to be successful, they have to be places that make your life better to be in them.
Yes.
And, and movements that are based on burden and responsibility alone fail.
Right.
And there was a lot of fear of sexuality when AIDS was first recognized. And, safe sex had to be invented by Joe Sonnabend and Michael Callan and Richard Berkowitz. And
by the way, you didn't mention that, but that's one of the other things that we can say ACT UP did, was to circulate through its publications and fact sheets information about things like safe sex, which had a huge impact, I think, on basically saving lives.
Well, the Asian Pacific Islander caucus, I forget what they were called, something like that. They did all these kinds of actions of going to Asian gay bars and handing out condoms wrapped in lucky red Chinese New Year paper, because the safe sex people were ignoring immigrants and the materials were not in enough languages. So there was, but that was one milieu that ACT UP was involved in that way, just one of the many things that they were doing. So at the beginning of ACT UP, the men that I interviewed said that at the beginning everyone did safe sex. And of course, early on, people didn't know their status because there were no treatments. So why get tested if there's no treatments, right? That did break down later, and that's in the book as well, and that came up on the floor of the organization. But yeah, it was life affirming. It was sex positive. Everyone was very young. People were very good looking, and that was part of its power.
So ACT UP, as you said, it still exists. It's got a website. It does things, but it doesn't have a central place in our political imagination, or I don't think. And yet, of course, AIDS isn't over, as you point out. I mean, there are still, you say, 13,000 people dying of AIDS every year in the US. And as you point out, most of them are poor, because one of the things that happened after the development of the protease inhibitors was the development of successful but expensive forms of therapy that can keep people alive for very, very, I mean, essentially, unless you're unlucky, more or less forever. I mean, for the normal lifespan. And of course, that reminds us that one of the things that maybe ACT UP might have had people wanting to do that didn't succeed was to create a universal healthcare system in this country, so that kind of problem, which continues to face poor people even after Obamacare, that problem didn't go away. And just to mention perhaps another negative before, I mean, I think we should sort of be, it's not a matter of balance, but I think there's an important lesson here. One of the legacies of the parallel track and the faster drug approval, of course, was that it did contribute to the neoliberal gutting of the regulatory state and some of the limits on big pharma. And just a few days ago, as I'm sure you know, Biogen's drug Aduhelm was approved by the FDA, and this will make lots and lots of money for Aduhelm and raise the healthcare costs for everybody. And I think there's a view among experts that it almost certainly won't help a single person with Alzheimer's, that it's not, in fact, a drug that's going to work. So are there legacies of ACT UP that we should regret? Or is that a legacy? I mean, obviously,
it's part of a larger problem, which is that AIDS activism was able to overcome HIV, but it couldn't overcome capitalism. And it's what we're seeing today with the COVID vaccine, that, America's hoarding the COVID vaccine and there's countries that can't get access to it. And it's this thing about capitalism constantly impeding scientific sharing and all kinds of sharing. And not only do we need a coherent healthcare system in America, we need a coherent global healthcare system that's equitable. And those are the obstacles.
So what do you think I mean, because there were people very much inside ACT UP for whom that was, I mean, maybe not the overthrow of capitalism, but certainly the serious reform of our healthcare system was. How did that? I mean, maybe that couldn't have been done this way, or maybe it sort of got lost focus for a reason. And if there was a reason, what was the reason?
It's hard to say why ACT UP broke up, and I go into it in great detail, and you can draw your own conclusions. My personal belief is that I think that we all went a little crazy and that it was so painful, so many people dying. By the time of 92, the medications were not looking good, and a lot of people died. And I think that people took it out on each other. I honestly think that that's the main reason. But the official reason at the time was a fight about access and women. That, there were different constituencies in ACT UP and they had different degrees of access. And famously, like Larry Kramer went to Yale with the head of Bristol Myers Pharmaceutical Company, and he could call him up and get a meeting, right? And he could bring other people from ACT UP who were similarly socially positioned to the men in pharma. When the women ran a 4-year campaign to try to get the definition of AIDS changed so that women could qualify for benefits in experimental trials, they couldn't get a meeting with Fauci for 2 years. And this is the same organization. And they didn't get the help from the men who had access that they wanted. So that, was a material difference about commitment to access. And that became the foregrounded issue. But I don't think that was the real issue.
You do raise, I mean, another thing, which I just thinking of lessons for future activism, I think is an interesting thing to think about, which is that there's always a tension in an organization that's doing two, I mean, ACT UP was doing two things at once, right? You call them the insider and the outsider strategy. And maybe that's what they were called in the organization.
That's what they called it, yeah.
So one strategy is to, throw blood into throw blood-colored dye at things and do demonstrations and disrupt masses in Catholic cathedrals. And the other is to force through, perhaps in part through that outside action, some of your people into the conversations with the people who run things in pharma and in the government that will allow them to hear what they need to know from the point of view of the people who are supposed to be the object of the exercise, the people who are falling sick and who need treatment. But it seems to me that, and of course, all movements when they start succeeding have an insider track, because that's what succeeding is. It's getting to the point where people will listen to you formally in the inside. But that produces a tension between the people who are sort of pure and want to get things, want to achieve the ends, but don't want to get involved with the insiders until the insiders concede, and the people who say, well, we've got to move along and they've invited us, so we're going.
I see it very differently, I
Good.
have to say. I think that, so let's look at how a campaign was structured. So ACT UP became the expert on the issue. They design the solution. They present the solution to the powers that be. The powers that be say no. ACT UP then does nonviolent civil disobedience in very theatrical and creative ways to pressure the institutions through the media. So the whole thing is organic and dynamic, right?
Yes.
The people who get in are the people that the inside of the power apparatus recognize and identify with, and there's a mutual identification. And maybe they have the same thing, maybe they have more in common with each other. Maybe they all went to Harvard or whatever, and they have more in common with each other than some of those people have with other people in ACT UP. And then there's a disinterest or a separation, and they're like, well, we're here. And it's not that people on the outside are pure. They would like to be inside too, but there's no one in the inside who looks like them. There's a lot of gatekeeping, and there's still gatekeeping today. And, maybe there's one person that's like you in a power structure, but I know, like, here I am, I'm a middle-aged lesbian, right? And there's not a lot of publishing houses or there's a lot of places where there's no one like me inside. And that's still true. And It was much more true then. So it's nothing about pure. It's about leaving people behind when you get in.
So why can't, was there no mechanism in the Democratic Assembly to get the people who were being invited in to say to them, you have to take some of the women, some of the people of color, you have to take them with you. Whether Dr. Fauci wants to talk to them or not, if he's willing to talk to you, you have to say to him, I'll come, but I need, but I'm coming with the people that I think.
There was like Moises Augusto, there were some people of color who got into government committees. But one of the biggest fights was about women with AIDS, and when they finally got to be heard, the support from some of the men who had the most access was not there at that time, although since then it has been there. But, was that what that was really about? I think it was really about the pain that people were going through. Because, people were very young, and AIDS is a terrible death. And you're watching people really suffer and disintegrate, and it's scary. And I think that there was a lot of pressure on everybody.
Among the legacies of that period, though, is in fact the group of people who have been very influential in shaping AIDS policy, some of whom left at the time of one of these breaks up. And I wonder what you think about, do you think of them as part of the plus story, part of the story, or do you think of them as maybe having let the thing down a bit by not recognizing that their access was something that they could have used more, let's say, democratically, or more in a more open way?
I think it's very complex, because the people in ACT UP who were elite were very few. Like there was Peter Staley, who's one of the leaders of ACT UP, and he had been a stockbroker at JP Morgan, but he was the only stockbroker from JP Morgan who joined ACT UP.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so, or like Larry Kramer, who was a very privileged and connected person, but he used his power for people with AIDS. He screamed at people that he had access to, and most of the gay men like him did not do that. So these guys were exceptional, you know, and I think they did incredible work. And in my book, I give them enormous credit, but they're not the only ones. A lot of other people did very important work as well. So that's more my point. I'm not blaming anybody. And at the time, I did not take sides in that split. That split happened within a small group, and most of us just sat back and watched.
Right. I mean, I think some people sort of read that in a way that you don't, because the way you describe it, basically 12 people left, and they went on working with, and other people who didn't leave went on working with them and were still going on to the Monday meeting. So it isn't as if, it's a bit hard for me to figure out from the description of what actually happened, why in a large organization like this, the departure of maybe 12 people who, as I say, other people who stayed continued to work with, felt like such a big thing.
Well, it was very painful, and it was brutal. And some of the people that I interviewed said that they regretted their behavior and they thought that they were arrogant. And that's in the book as well.
Yes.
You know, none of this is cut and dried because these are humans. And ACT UP was a very humane place. And people acted out all the time. I mean, so many crazy things went on. Somebody stole $10,000. Somebody pretended he was HIV positive when he wasn't. 2 people OD'd and died. You know, it's like there was a lot of it was not respectability politics. And ACT UP contained all of that behavior and recognized it because it was a profoundly oppressed group of people. They didn't have supremacy ideology about themselves. Once people got a little more comfortable and had a little more access, maybe that shifted and people reverted back to their class position. I also think that some people wanted to get money from pharma and work with pharma, and ACT UP would never have allowed that, and that inhibited them. I don't, you know, so, and that's just a theory that I've heard from 2 people. I don't have evidence for that.
Why would those people have felt that you shouldn't take money from pharma?
Because ACT UP never took money from the government or corporations. All of the money came from the community. Because it can be compromising. Right.
I guess that's what I was thinking of when I talked about purity. I mean, there's a worry that.
But that's not. That's purity? I think that's practical.
Right. Maybe. Maybe we disagree about that.
Yeah.
Can I mention one other thing that I hadn't sort of fully grasped, and the book helped me to see, which is how important ACT UP was in helping a lot of gay youth. I'm not talking about people in their 20s. I'm talking about people in their teens. In a city which was a pretty frightful place for gay teens who were kicked out by their families in particular. And that included people who'd come from other places where their families had kicked them out. They weren't all native New Yorkers. And you described some of the ways in which, through this organization, it was possible.
There was a group called Yell that was like a youth brigade of ACT UP. And of course, there was a lot of stigma at the time of working cross-generationally because gay people are always accused of being child molesters, right? But these were gay kids in the public schools and in private schools who wanted to get safe sex information and clean needle information and condoms in their schools. And they were activists at the middle school level. It's very exciting to read about.
Well, look, I hope you feel you've had a chance to talk about the things you wanted to talk about in the book. I've talked about the things I wanted to talk about in the book. They're not all of them because there are so many. But we should probably turn now to some questions from from the audience. The first question up here is one that you've already answered, actually, which was whether does the FBI and other groups infiltrate ACT UP? Yes, I mean, there's clear evidence. I think in the book, the book publishes transcripts. I think they don't make it entirely clear whether they were insiders who pass on information or whether there were actual plants. And it's often hard because despite the Freedom of Information Act, the FBI can cover up almost everything in the stuff they release. It can be very difficult to interpret. It's very redacted. So let me ask you the second question, which is, can you tell us a bit about the books you what were recommended in the opening slides. What
Oh,
about
yes.
these books made you pick them for us to think
Oh,
about?
I think that they're marvelous books. So Rabi Ahmadine is one of my favorite writers. He's a gay, openly HIV positive Lebanese writer who's based in Beirut and San Francisco. And his book Kool-Aid's The Art of War is one of my favorite AIDS novels. He talks about, he juxtaposes the experience of being HIV positive against the backdrop of the Lebanese Civil War. And it's just an absolutely gorgeous novel. Mary Gateskill, another fantastic writer, her novel Veronica is a very interesting novel about a woman who dies of AIDS. And it came out later. It came out after protease inhibitors when there was no context really at the time. And I went to see her speak and I asked her, what's it like to publish a novel about AIDS right now? And she said, no one has mentioned it. None of the reviews mentioned it and none of the interviewers mentioned it, but that's what the book's about. And it's beautifully written. The third is Martin Duberman, who did a joint biography of Michael Callan and Essex Hempel, two heroes of our community who could easily be forgotten. And Marty has done everything he can to document as much as he can. He's like 92 and he's still doing it. And then the final was a book by Richard McKay that takes apart the patient zero myth. You know, there was that book, And the Band Played On, that was published by St. Martin's at the end. It created this evil person with AIDS, patient zero, Gaetan Dugas, the Quebecois patient zero airplane steward who supposedly infected everybody. And that was a myth. And they knew it when they put it in the book, Randy Schultz and his editor, Michael Denneny. But they made the overt decision to put the distortion in. And Richard McKay just completely decimates it. And it's an amazing, fascinating book.
Those sound like four very good reasons to read those
Yeah.
those books. Here's another question, interesting question. Did the writing of this book inform your current activism at all? That is, have you put your understanding of movement building to work in other things you've been doing?
Well, I mean, I learned a lot of this before I came to ACT UP because I was in the reproductive rights movement. And subsequently, I've been involved in the Palestine Solidarity Movement. I'm on the advisory board of Jewish Voice for Peace. And that is a movement that takes place on a lot of different levels and is growing rapidly globally. But there has not been a tipping point and has had no impact on the ground. And so it's a very frustrating place, even though people's attitudes are changing around the world. No, I think that the thing that the book influenced me the most doing was, you know, I consider myself to be primarily a novelist. And when people say, oh, you're an activist, I feel like that's very second, third, or fourth. My primary identity is as a novelist. And I've written a lot of novels, and they've been all different kinds of novels, and many of them have been formally inventive. And that experience is what enabled me to construct this book. Because when I started writing it, I realized from the beginning it could not be chronological because it wouldn't be accurate. Because so many things are happening at the same time that I needed to invent a kind of horizontal structure. And fortunately, from all of the fiction that I've written, I had the skills to do that. And it was very exciting formally for me. Mm-hmm. So that was something that I really got out of writing the book.
We might define a novelist as someone who writes formally inventive stuff. I mean, it's the novelists we care about. So I think it's one of the great things about reading a work of nonfiction by a fiction writer, if I may say so, that you can see that you're dealing with a writer yes. As it goes along, and that means not just that it's well written and all that, but that it's doing things with the writing.
I mean, a novel is something that ultimately is cumulative. It's not a series of articles, right?
Right.
And so a huge nonfiction book like this had to have the same impact, that it drives towards the end, and that's what I wanted it to do.
Got another question here. How do you see ACT UP's legacy in today's activist movements? Well, perhaps I should say, do you? And what lessons have been overlooked, do you think, in contemporary activism that it would be useful to draw to people's attention?
Well, a few things that I think would be very helpful. One is that ACT UP did not put theory first, it put action first. And as Maxine Wolf, one of the leaders of ACT UP, said, if you do action first, your theory will emerge because you have to make decisions and then that coheres your values. And if you do theory first, you all end up polarized and you're fighting with each other and nothing's actually at stake. So that's a really good lesson. Another thing is that women and people of color in ACT UP did not stop the action to demand consciousness raising about sexism or racism. Instead, they very smartly harnessed the resources of the organization, which were ample, and used them to support their constituencies and their projects. So for example, when the Latino caucus realized that people in Puerto Rico needed support, they got money from ACT UP to go to Puerto Rico and start ACT UP Puerto Rico. When the women's campaign needed for HIV positive women to go to hearings or to go to demonstrations, the travel and hotel were paid for by ACT UP. And that money was raised mostly by an art auction that was organized by Patrick Moore and Anne Philbin. And Patrick now runs the Andy Warhol Museum, and Annie runs the Hammer Museum in LA. So they were art world insiders, and that auction raised $650,000.
That's actually another thing that the book brings out is there are so many different activities and so many different kinds of people doing so many different kinds of things, but there was a lot of artistic activity around ACT UP, in support of ACT UP, and also maybe things that the people who did them might resist calling art because they might think that was sort of dilettantish.
Oh, I think everyone in ACT UP wanted to be an artist.
Well, wanted to be an artist.
Yes.
But maybe the artists didn't want to be artists. I don't know. But I mean, because there's some sort of ambivalence, I think, in the way that people talk about the work of, say, Grand Fury, which I suppose what I mean is they didn't want to be co-opted by the art world, the official art world.
Well, they weren't. I mean, but it was
Yes.
interesting because I have a 150-page section on art in ACT UP.
Yes.
And when I started writing it, I realized that if I only looked at the gallery work or museum work, I got white people. But if I looked at community-based artwork, nightlife, there were people of color in ACT UP. So if you have an actually accurate depiction of art in the service of community, you ended up with a very broad spectrum.
Yes. Here's another question. I was 23 when I moved to NYC in 1987. My uncle died of AIDS in 1988. I decided to join ACT UP. And while I was very active in the feminist movement working on abortion rights, I was struck by how activists in ACT UP also participated in many other activist movements. People I knew in ACT UP worked so broadly in the middle of the AIDS crisis. Can you talk about how ACT UP influenced other activists throughout NYC and the country in those early years, right at the beginning, in other movements?
Actually, there was only one non-AIDS issue that ACT UP was involved in, and that was abortion rights. And it was so assumed that it was never even discussed on the floor, and they never voted on it. They just did it. So ACT UP members were involved in what was called clinic defense, which was the anti-abortionists would stand in front of the abortion clinics and harass women going in. And ACT UP people would accompany them so that they could get past the onslaught to get in. And the famous action at St. Patrick's Cathedral was a coalition between ACT UP and WHAM, which was a reproductive rights group.
Do you have views about why, maybe this is a question you may not want to answer, but why the Catholic Church was so terrible on these issues at that time? I mean,
well, this was before the priest scandal, right? So the Catholic Church was at the height of its power in the city. And whoever was the cardinal, they were in office longer than the mayor. So they had huge power. And normally they would stay in their lane, the Catholic schools, but they went into the public schools. And that was the offense, and people felt that the Catholic Church trying to keep condoms out of the public schools meant that people would die. And so ACT UP made the incredible decision to disrupt Mass in December of 1989. And that was really a very big turning point for ACT UP's power.
I mean, it alienated a lot of people as well.
Yes, it alienated a lot of people, but what were those people doing to end the AIDS crisis?
Right. No, I'm just wondering. I mean, it was clearly a sign of power because to get in there and not so much disrupting the Mass, but being organized in such a way that you could get that disruption onto the front pages and into the whole business of the.
it was a sign of spiritual power. You know, Dr. King, when he talks about direct action, he talks about self purification. And of course, a lot of people who were Catholic and ACT UP had been put through hell,
Yes.
right, by the church when they were growing up, by their families. And we were always told that our lives were less important and that we had to respect the facade of these religious institutions and they were more important than we were. And to overcome that, to really truly overcome that, was a huge leap forward for gay people and people with AIDS.
A central part of the planning for that event, as your book describes, involved thinking very seriously about at what moment to do the action,
Yes.
in order to be respectful of the distinction between the sacramental and the non-sacramental parts of the mass. And there were some people who didn't go along with that and who broke ranks, as it were, because it was ACT UP and some people did their own thing. But I thought that was incredibly interesting, that thought, because I assume, because you've got everybody in, you've got Catholic gay people in, and they know this distinction matters.
It wasn't the Catholics who were
It wasn't,
concerned.
okay.
It was the Protestants.
The Protestants,
I think
okay.
they didn't want ACT UP to look like an anti-Catholic organization.
Okay.
But I think the Catholics and the Jews didn't care.
Because they were angry at the church. All right, but so still, the Protestants who did that were thinking that a distinction that makes a big difference to Christian people, which is the distinction between sacramental and non-sacramental activities, would somehow figure in the response of people to it. And that struck me as a very interesting thought, because I can't imagine a regular Catholic saying, well, at least they didn't interrupt the sacraments.
Right.
If you shout down the cardinal when he's preaching, which is technically not a sacramental moment. Nevertheless, I just found that a very good example of kind of the depth of thinking that went into these sorts of events, and also I think the sort of sense of strategy that meant that you could organize an outsider event outside a meeting that your insiders were attending in order to strengthen the hand of the insiders, and all that kind of strategizing struck me as maybe relevant to the question the one back. I mean, lessons for today, that you don't give up your outside, the moment you don't give up the outside activities, the moment you're invited into the room, you need them there in order to strengthen your hand as you're doing your.
And you try to make room for them to come in.
And you want as many people as possible to come in. Exactly. Right. You want and many different kinds of people as possible who are relevant.
And you want to change the concept of the room once you're in there.
Right.
Right.
And all of that is so interesting. So I think in answer to the person who was saying, what are the lessons for today? Surely that's a lesson for now and the future. Maybe one you already knew before you were involved with ACT UP, as you say, because you've been involved in other forms of activism. As the author of Cosmopolitanism and the Lies That Bind, I'd like to say to the author of The Cosmopolitan and the Ties That Bind, that it's been great talking to you. And I really enjoyed reading this book, and it's full of stuff. I earnestly urge anybody who's even a tiny bit interested in this to read the book. It's a big book. It has lots of stuff in it, and among other things, it's interesting as the author said, because of its formal interest, the interest of it as the form of writing that it is, and of the voices, the many voices that it allows us to hear. So, thank you very much, Sarah.
And thank you, and I'm so honored that you did this.
Oh no, it was a great pleasure. I really did enjoy reading the book enormously. Thank you.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us tonight. We are playing closing slides. This slide shows an image of the featured book. The cover text appears on a red background, which is torn at the edges to resemble a weathered street poster. The text reads, "A Political History of ACT UP, New York, 1987 to 1993. Let the Record Show, Sarah Schulman." Around the torn edges, a black and white photograph of a large group of protesters being held back by police is visible. Let the Record Show is available for purchase from the library shop, on.nypl.org/shop live. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Reserve a copy for free with a New York Public Library card. Visit tonight's event page to find this title in a variety of formats, nypl.org/live. The last slide shows Live from NYPL upcoming events. Tuesday, June 22nd, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Positive Obsession, Happy Birthday Octavia E. Butler, featuring Hanif Abdurraqib, Stephen Barnes, Ayanna Jameson, Namwali Serpell, B. Steadwell, and many more. Wednesday, June 23rd, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Anthrovision, Gillian Tett with Thomas L. Friedman. Monday, June 28th, 6 p.m. Eastern Time. The Heart of Business, Hubert Joly with Ariana Huffington, co-presented with the library's Thomas Yoseloff Business Center at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library. For more information and to register, visit nypl.org/live.